Okay,
Yep.
so welcome back to Cracks in Postmodernity. Today we're with Armin Rosen, who writes for the Tablet, amongst some other publications, right?
Yeah, I write for the Washington Examiner pretty
Okay.
frequently, mostly on music and popular culture, and here and there, I contribute pieces on kind of odd topics, but mostly tablet these days, luckily.
Nice. So before we get into your article, which you wrote a couple weeks ago called Zoomers Like It Ugly, can you just give a little bit more background on the stuff you write about, how you got into writing and all of that?
Sure. So I am kind of the New York reporter for Tablet Magazine,
Mhm.
which is kind of a leading Jewish interest publication. But in recent years, I mean, it's always had kind of a broader, area of focus. It's kind of almost like a nationally focused magazine that's run by a bunch of Jews in some ways, but it's kind of broadened our scope, especially in the last kind of 5 or so years since I began working there. And they've kind of set me on all sorts of different types of articles. I've done kind of like investigative pieces about lobbying organizations in DC. I've done a lot of kind of local New York news. But what really first got me into journalism back when I was in college was not music per se, but using journalism as an excuse to get into shows for free, which is something I got really, really good at, and is still kind of one of the main attractions of the job. In a sense, you can kind of nag people to let you into things, um, you know, and that comes with like a certain responsibility. It's like going to a show for fun is very different from going to a show that you're going to have to write something about. But by now, I've had like 15 years of practice at it. Uh, and I'm kind of used to to going to concerts and kind of taking a look around and figuring out who might be there and why and what might make it different from everything else you've been to or exactly the same as everything else you go to anyway. And it was sort of in that spirit that I was able to talk my editors into letting me go to Rolling Loud.
Okay. Now, was this your first time going there?
Yeah, I mean, I had always kind of wanted to check out Rolling Loud. I mean, the lineups are always just like really, really almost like a wish list of people who you theoretically want to see, at a hip hop festival, along with like 20 or 30 other people who, with like ridiculous names you'd never heard of, a number of whom sometimes end up being, getting really, really big somewhere down the line. Uh, and I had assumed that like COVID was going to get it canceled.
Mhm.
And I was kind of shocked that both Governor's Ball and Rolling Loud kind of happened in the same like month long span at the same parking lot, out in Queens.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, it was my first time kind of going, and I knew that like Rolling Loud has like a bit of a reputation of being like kind of drama filled.
Okay.
Uh, it's a festival where really bizarre and unexpected things take place. And the New York edition was probably the most bizarre and unexpected festival they've ever thrown for reasons positive and negative that we can get
Yeah.
into.
Yeah, so just before we get into the content of the article,
Sure.
I have to say, so I think within the span of like the first week that it came out, two separate people sent the article to me. And normally, like people send me stuff all the time, and I don't really read everything because,
Yeah.
my attention span is short. But after the second person sent this to me, I was like, okay, I'll check it out. But after reading like the first two paragraphs, I was hooked right away.
Oh, thanks.
Because it's these artists you were talking about, I guess, are largely trap drill artists. And I've always been fascinated by the sound, but also by the performances of these artists because they're really tapping into something about our culture right now, especially the younger generation. But I've never found the words to really explain it. But when I read this, I was like, whoa, like this is really fleshing it all out, which is very exciting for me. So
Thank you.
yeah, let's just start with like when you were there, what were your first thoughts before you actually articulated everything in this article? Like, how did it first impact you while you're at the concert?
Well, when you get to any music festival, like and I kind of go into this in the story in a way, like there's such an adrenaline wave when you show up at a festival where there are tens of thousands of people, and like maybe it's 2 or 3 in the afternoon and you have the whole day ahead of you, and you immediately cycle through your mind, like, you know, like, oh, I'm going to see, you know, Trippie Redd and Ski Mask and like the rest of these guys in the space of like 5 hours, and it's going to be awesome. And like everybody else is really happy to be there. And then, you know, the sun starts going down, and, you know, the spotlights and the lasers and the flamethrowers start coming out on stage. And, you know, you start to realize the drugs are hitting wherever you look. And it's really kind of like a different type of environment that's really like kind of outside of, you know, the regular kind of run of normal life. And there's something like very kind of addictive about that. And there's something very addictive about just like getting blasted with sound and light for hours and hours at a time. Like it's almost numbing in a way. Mm-hmm. Like it almost kind of like beats your nerves into submission, but that itself is kind of an addictive feeling.
Yeah.
And it almost begins from like the moment you get to a place, an environment like Rolling Loud, and everybody else who's there is kind of expecting it to be something special and outside of normal life as well. Just the way that people dress, the way they behave. It's not a cheap thing to go to either. Like, I think including fees, it's like $450 or something like that. And a lot of the people there are teens. It's like, yeah, this is something that people really kind of get themselves, you know, they might spend months essentially like working towards being able to be there. Mm-hmm. And it's possible to be like really cynical about live music these days. Yeah. And it's especially possible to be cynical about Rolling Loud for reasons that we'll probably discuss. But, you know, these things inevitably exist for the fans, for the people who are there. And a lot of them seem like they're having a great time, you know, for the most part, at least the ones who hadn't like, you know, gotten too spun out or were tripping too hard or whatever, which is something you also inevitably see these days. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah. And I think what's really interesting is you're comparing this kind of sensory overload at the festival to the state of the culture in general. This, I mean, I guess you call like a hyper moralism, this performative activism. How did you make that connection between the kind of ethos at the concert and the larger cultural kind of moment we're in?
Yeah. Well, it gets back to just, you know, what I was saying about how drama-filled New York Rolling Loud was this year. So the first day, it was Thursday, Friday, Saturday, because the 31st was Halloween. And I think the hip hop division of the NYPD, like, didn't want to authorize a giant rap festival where everyone was in costume.
Yeah.
That's just one man's theory. Anyway, so the first day, the Thursday of the festival, Lil Nas X made a surprise performance with Jack Harlow, surprise appearance to do Industry Baby. And then at the very, you know, the first night headliner was 50 Cent, and he brought out DaBaby on stage.
Wow.
Right, who obviously got kind of quasi-canceled over, you know, these allegedly homophobic comments he made, which led to like an open feud with Lil Nas X. And so this sent like this strange kind of message where it's like, you know, clearly the people who run this festival, and by the way, nobody there, like DaBaby didn't get booed at all or anything. Like people were happy to see him. And it really kind of drove home that there's kind of like this like elite dominated kind of culture of moralism and judgment, which is like, you know, almost this quasi, you know, like Protestant Geneva or something under John Calvin, where there are these codes of behavior that everybody has to follow. But then you have this other massive, even more massive realm of popular culture, which is dominated by hip hop, which doesn't care about any of those things. Probably like the most insane example of this being if you go back to the YNW Melly album, which came out, I think at some point over the summer. And you just look at the list of features on that album, and like Melly is like currently, you know, in jail for an alleged double homicide that he almost certainly committed. I mean, I don't want people coming after me or anything, but like, you know, people have looked into this and like, there's really no great alternative hypothesis. Like he may very well have done it, let's say. And that's like murder of like multiple people. And like Kanye West has a feature on that album. And like there are good and bad things about that. The good thing is that we have like a sector of American culture that actually is not just completely free, but incredibly successful, and that has like, again, like the organic loyalty of like young people, and that also is just like better and more creative and more interesting than elite culture in practically every way. The flip side of that is that there's kind of this very careful like industry exploitation of notoriety. In a way, it is almost like part of the product. And then second of all, it makes it much harder to actually root out people and behaviors and tendencies that might actually need to be rooted out. One of the other things that made this so drama-filled, New York Rolling Loud, is that it was the last Travis Scott performance before Astroworld, where 10 people were killed. Could something like that have happened at Rolling Loud in New York? Like, yeah, easily, of course. Like, it's dark out, the weather sucked. It's like a bunch of young people who might not be in their right minds. Like, yeah, of course it could have happened there. And I think Rolling Loud has given some indication that Travis Scott might actually headline Miami later this year. They've been teasing that on their Twitter feed. So it's like, on the one hand, it's like very encouraging and very constructive that we have a sort of alternative to the censoriousness and the moralism that kind of dominates a lot of American life. On the other hand, it's almost a cynical element of like a large kind of money-making edifice of modern music. And it does kind of give rise to things that really are, to things you would rather not see, let's say, at the center of American pop culture in some ways.
Yeah, and it's just weird to me that for a lot of these artists, you just see how incoherent a lot of these moralistic rules are, because like they're arbitrarily applied to some of the artists, but also they're used by the labels as kind of puppets or mouthpieces for these causes. And like you'll see, especially with like the baby, that it doesn't always work out well. But it's interesting to me though that you're saying for young people, they tend to be drawn to these figures because they're precisely not elite. And I don't know, like I see a lot of young people who will go along with the bandwagon of these moralistic social justice, whatever. And yet I don't know, like how do you make sense of that young people are drawn to these causes but also are drawn to the non-elitism of these figures?
That's a good question. Sorry about that. Just had to decline a call there. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I know that like in polls, I've seen this written that like cancel culture polls worse among Zoomers than it does among members of any other kind of generational cohort. There's always kind of a reaction to whoever kind of the next youngest group of people are, right? You need something to rebel against, and these are the group that you know best compared to maybe the parents of the millennials or whatever. That makes some sense. There's also just the kind of percolation of more kind of liberal open values down to younger people, which is something that you sort of always see. My kind of explanation for it is that it's just sort of, you just find lots of sort of like big and small incoherencies in American life right now. And like, is there tension between being like a massive Travis Scott stan and also being a huge believer in social justice causes? Like if you want to drill down into it, yes, there is. But I'm also a great believer that like art always wins out over politics, like 100% of the time. And that like people love saying otherwise and they love pretending otherwise, but like you are going to get more out of listening to Travis Scott than you are going to get out of like participating in X or Y social or political cause. Like like the music that you like is going to sort of like edify you, inspire you, and provide a certain coherency to your life that like political commitments can't for most people,
Yeah.
unless you're like, unless you're like certain friends of mine whose life is like the DSA or
Sure.
activism or whatever. But that's just kind of not how most people are. And it's like, this is kind of another thing that I guess I kind of admire about the Zoomers. And it's kind of the good side of stan culture in a way. It's like, yeah, like young people should have artists who they really believe in, and who they're not just going to like simply turn their back on. Maybe you'd like those artists to be better or deeper or more interesting or whatever. But the fact that like people were willing to cheer, DaBaby at Rolling Loud at least shows that people really actually do believe that their musical taste should override other things. And I happen to think that music and musical taste is extremely important. Now, I don't like DaBaby very much, and I think that his flow is pretty monotonous and predictable, and I don't think his music is that good. But there are some positive things about the fact that it's proved extremely hard and even impossible to cancel, certain types of musical artists.
Yeah. But I don't know, when I think about some of these figures, like you're saying, that it's weird to me that so many young people will like stand them, but also post all these social justice hashtags in their Twitter bios or whatever, because it's like a lot of these artists are like the epitome of Western decadence. So to be saying that, I stand for the cause of the oppressed, and it's just like they don't see this cognitive dissonance between, again, these people who are working for these major elite corporations and whose lifestyles, whose image is extremely decadent, and yet my interests are for those who don't have power, who don't have opportunities. It's like, I don't know.
Right.
This is why I think it does, like at the end of the day, you can't live out this moralistic social justice narrative for very long, because it's just not sustainable. It's not interesting. Like at a certain point, there needs to be some decadence, some like we can't be moral constantly, like something about the glamorous lifestyle of these celebrities is attractive for real reason.
Well, and also what sort of attracted me, or what really sort of, one of the things that made me kind of a hip hop fan in high school, was watching kind of like the classic era, like say like 2001 to 2005, let's say, period of like rap videos where, it'd be like, the This Is the Way We Ball video, I think it is, where he has to spend $1 million in one day, and just like just the ostentation of them. And I realized like it took me not that long to realize that like, oh, actually like some of this is supposed to be ironic. Like this is about both like the desire for wealth and the grossness of wealth. And like, if you can kind of hold those two thoughts in your mind at once, it becomes like very clever and funny. And like, that's always been sort of something that kind of hip hop can do that other sort of, genres and artistic modes are kind of like less interested in. And like, you go on and on about kind of like the role of bragging about wealth in rap music. The thing that I love about that is that like, in like polite society, that's like the worst and like gauchest thing you can do, right? Is talk about how rich you are. But in hip hop, it's like a rejection of that convention completely. And then it doesn't just reject that convention. It's like, well, we're gonna like make it actually kind of the center of what we're doing, and it's gonna seem like very funny and hip and exciting to like actually brag about how much money you have. And then you have like rappers like Meek Mill, where who very effectively and in a way that I don't think is cynical actually use their own wealth as a sign of like defying the social order, right? The famous line in Dreams and Nightmares where he's like, oh, when when I rolled up in this Aston Martin, you all thought it was rented. Well, like, it's actually mine. Which is where some of the kind of more liberating character in the music can come from. And again, this is stuff that art can do, but I don't think these are things that like politics or even most activism can really kind of do. It's why like art is so important. It's why it's like better than most anything else in existence.
But what would you make of a figure like J. Cole, who prides himself on like, oh, I don't show off all my bling. I'm all about like things that are deeper than money, and
Right.
Do you think
That's
it's like
fine.
inauthentic?
No, I don't think J. Cole's inauthentic at all. Although I'll say this much, like, J. Cole was playing at the same time as Playboi Carti the second day of Rolling Loud.
Really?
And
Wow.
there was no hesitation about skipping J. Cole to see Playboi Carti. Right. It's like one of them is like a very good, interesting, kind of rapper who's like very lyrically elevated and really good. And like, is he as great as Kendrick Lamar? He's not, but like, he doesn't need to be. I'm not going to badmouth J. Cole. It's between that and like, what Playboi Carti represents, which is something entirely different and new and weird and dark, and in some ways very exciting, and in other ways very bleak.
Yeah. Because I saw Cole when he was at Barclays in October, and like,
oh, cool.
I really respect what he's doing because I know he believes in it, and I think like it is morally more integritous than what's out there in the mainstream. I do think it becomes gimmicky after a while that he's like, oh, all these people want to show off their bling and they're chasing after temporary happiness. We need to chase after love and being there for each other. And it's like, okay, I mean, yes, we know that's true, but if you're gonna just keep harping on that, it just gets corny after a while. But he was like, it was clear that in the show he kept saying like, I know you guys want me to play my radio hits, but after that I'm going to play some of the deeper cuts because I'm a real rapper and I'm a lyricist, and I know it's not as exciting, but that's what I want to do. And it's like, I get that, but at a certain point it's just like, entertain the crowd. I don't know.
Yeah, right. And it's also just like this weird sort of tension in rap music that I don't think really came along until like the last 10 years, where like the tension between like rappers and rapping, I guess, where like, lyricism, the things that like had basically, been the undisputed point of the entire genre, started to almost be seen as like an obstacle towards other things that artists were trying to accomplish. Right. Like, I mean, this is sort of like one of the oldest tensions in music, period. Like, do the words get in the way of the music? What's kind of like the point of it? Do you really need to, throw words into a symphony or whatever? And rap's going through its own kind of version of that. Really kind of like, I don't think it like obviously didn't begin with Young Thug, but he's kind of the figure that comes the most to mind is like someone whose focus is really on kind of texture and melody. Of course, he has it in him to be like an incredibly elevated lyricist. But he can, that's kind of what makes him so brilliant. He can kind of like be many different things at once. Chief Keef was kind of another example of this. Again, someone who is not trying to dazzle people with lyricism or storytelling, who wasn't necessarily trying to leave you scratching your head about any great moral questions per se. Although much like Young Thug, I think Keef has it in him to be a really quite brilliant lyricist at times. And in a way, like a J. Cole type figure is almost like a throwback in a way that maybe doesn't necessarily, not that it's out of step with the current state of the art, because he's hugely popular, and his album was one of the biggest of the year. But he is sort of one of those figures who stands in contrast to a lot of other things going on.
Yeah. So now I wanted to shift. There's one line that really caught me here, the way you
Sure.
talk about the kind of ugliness of all
Yeah.
of it. So you say that it's no accident that the aesthetics of this space, if it can be said to have one, is a chaos of imagery and sound, which reads in any conventional framework as ugliness. The ugliness of pop comes from overload and aimlessness and is the opposite of the purposeful ugliness embraced by that part of the supposedly socially conscious elite. So explain what you mean by the ugliness of this space.
Sure. Um, I guess what I mean by it is that like there isn't a lot in kind of contemporary pop culture or really in like contemporary American culture in general in the last several decades that really aims for beauty as an ideal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, another sort of area, kind of subtopic of mine that I've loved writing about over the years is architecture, and just the puzzling question of why the built environment nearly everywhere on Earth has gotten uglier and uglier and uglier.
Yeah.
Like, and at a place like Rolling Loud, again, you're like bombarded with sort of these disconnected images. It's pixelated, video of skulls on fire and people in Grateful Dead shirts where you're kind of unclear why they're wearing them. Like, just this kind of mishmash of everything all at once. Again, in an environment where you're getting blasted with sound and light, and it's like, you're kind of like you're pretty far downstream from like standing and contemplating like Monet water lilies or something, or let's say you're not exactly in like the Japanese courtyard at the Met. This is sort of a fire hose approach to things. And like there's no sort of real attempt to isolate any of it into any kind of like single thing you can contemplate. Right. There's no contemplation happening at most big music festivals. Not to single out Rolling Loud. I mean, I've been to Bonnaroo and I was at Government's Ball not long before, and it's like these are not places where you are necessarily going to have like a sublime experience of the sort of eternal ineffable stuff of the universe. But we also like, but culture in general is kind of like that. I mean, I mentioned in the story, and this was like kind of a weird interpolation because it had nothing to do with Zoomers, but I left it in there and my editors left it in there because I guess it just felt true. Like, have you been to the new Moynihan train hall? Right. The new train station next to Penn Station where Amtrak now goes. I mean, that's like a brutal space. That's a dehumanizing space.
Yeah.
There's nowhere to sit. There's no color. You have this awful clock that seems like it's like, the clock from Dark City or something that's hanging over. Like, there's nowhere to eat. There's nothing to do. Like, you're just there being uncomfortable until your train arrives or leaves. Yeah, until your train leaves. And it's almost this perfect sort of encapsulation of like the way that like much of American life and American culture makes you feel these days. Like, there actually is nothing to look at, nothing to do. Like, you are kind of nowhere for whatever time you're in this place.
It's like this extreme atomization, like totally disconnected from anything that's substantial, anything lasting, I guess.
Right. But then it was built, of course, to be right. I mean, this is the crazy thing about architecture. Like, a building isn't like a record or something. Like, they're doing it on purpose. They have like an actual sort of like blueprint. Like, they know what they're doing. It could have been better and more colorful and more exciting and less dehumanizing. But like, the choice was made that it was going to be the exact opposite of how it should have wound up. Now, what I kind of attribute that to, I mean, that's kind of an interesting question. Like, why are so many aspects of our culture so kind of alienated from any traditional idea of beauty? It's kind of hard to say. And that's not to say that all of it is. I mean, there's, again, to get back to popular music, like, I mean, you could hear things at Rolling Loud, or at any music festival that actually are quite beautiful.
Yeah. I felt that way at J. Cole's concert.
Yeah. But you're also feeling them again in a place where, you know, your mind and your nerves are under total bombardment at every second.
Yeah, the setting makes a difference, obviously.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like it's all at the service of capital, though, because like if the general cultural ethos is not ordered towards some objective truth,
Yeah.
then the art and entertainment needs to be focused on, I guess, desensitizing us, or
Yeah.
rather like the sensory overload, so that we just keep coming back for more without any actual reason, without really using our
Yeah.
I don't know, our capacity to think critically about why am I doing this.
Right. And this is kind of where like Playboi Carti comes in and why he became the focus of the essay. Uh, it wasn't just that he was the best performer. I don't know about best, but the most memorable performer at the festival by far. It's that his work kind of plays off of this and encourages it. Right. The, you know, the idea of like that it's never too much, just repeating those words at the beginning of the album, like never too much, never too much. Again, it's like almost this statement of being in a way. It's not a statement of being that I agree with necessarily, but the results certainly don't leave you feeling indifferent.
Yeah.
So, right. I mean, that was kind of the interesting question that I wanted to deal with. Like, is there anything to redeem the ugliness? Like, can it actually have a point? And where I came out, again, using Cardi, I guess, as kind of the touchstone here, is that, yeah, maybe it can have a point. In the long run, we'll see.
Yeah.
But there are at least hints that it can be something more than nihilism. Whether that something is you know, the kind of music that you or I would necessarily enjoy or choose to listen to is kind of a different story.
Yeah. I think it depends on how well the listeners, I don't know, their artistic or cultural sensibility has been formed. Because
Yeah.
I think for myself, like the stuff I listened to growing up was mostly um I was looking for something that could appeal to these kind of like base instincts, this need for distraction. But as I matured and as I started to understand music and art
Yeah.
more, I listened to it not for distraction or not for this instinctive kind of pleasure, but like I started to ask, like, I don't know, what is this artist saying, or what is it making me reflect on, like back to this point
Right.
of contemplation. And I just think, I don't know, on one hand, this particular type of music, I do think it's more disposed to this base level distraction, especially if these are young people listening to it who don't
Right.
have a strong a strong sense of how to read this stuff. But doesn't necessarily have to end in nihilism. Like you might be able to
Right.
come away like, I don't know. For me, when I listen to trap more generally, I do think there's something cathartic about it. Like it says
Yes.
something about this need for resolution in the midst of conflict, just the production, the sound. But again, like a young person may not be able to come away with that conclusion. Maybe for them, it's
Right.
just a distraction.
Right. Or they come away from that conclusion if they get to see it live. Like this was the shocking thing about Carti. Like, you know, he had always been like a little bit of an enigma to me. Like, kind of, what is he doing? Is there really any kind of like skill or musicality to it? Like, what is this really? I was just, you know, I was kind of puzzled by Whole Lotta Red, which just struck me as kind of strange and like maybe a little bit monotonous. It was only kind of seeing him live that I kind of sort of, in seeing the way that like the Zoomers were reacting to him, that I kind of understood what this music really was. Like, oh, this serves the same function as like drone or, you know, or hardcore, you know, or goth or even heavy metal in a way. Like this is like the really loud, intense stuff that you can get lost in.
Yeah.
And the encouraging thing about Carti is that he's far more popular than like, you know, drone or goth or heavy metal musicians kind of ever were. I mean, he's one of the, you know, he's got like 16 million monthly listeners on Spotify. Like he's actually making stuff that's really quite strange. And whether, you know, his younger listeners process it that way, I kind of have no idea. But there was something like extremely encouraging about seeing like, you know, a bunch of like 18 and 19-year-olds like completely losing their minds, to an experience that reminded me of seeing swans or something.
Interesting.
I mean, because that's like the live music experience that I almost compare, right? Because most shows are kind of like whatever, and you get like that, let's say, top half of shows where maybe you think about it for another week, and then you have that like top quarter of shows where you can really kind of remember what they played, and then you have like at the top of that pyramid for me were my 3 times seeing Swans back in like 2014, the the pioneering New York industrial band.
Mm-hmm.
And where you see them and you're like, am I even at a show? Like, what the hell is going on? And it's an experience that like doesn't really come along very often, because it's not fun. It's like you're overwhelmed and you're confused, and you're almost like reassessing all of your sort of views on art and reality as it's happening. Seeing Fish for the first time was like that in a way. Not to, a little bit of an embarrassing admission there. And there was an element of that in seeing Playboi Carti, and in maybe sensing that like the people I was around were also caught up in the midst of something really intense and confusing that would restructure their kind of art, aesthetic and moral values in some respects. And there's something really cool about that I can't really hate on, even if the music itself, as I say, some of it's really good, some of it's a joke. A lot, it's the in its totality, I'd say his work is still a bit of an enigma in some respects. Although I think that like the really kind of clarifying thing, this didn't go in the story, this got cut, but the song that really kind of explains Playboi Carti is his guest spot on the Solange song Almeida, which is like almost a perfect song. It's like one of the best Solange songs. And it's like absolutely sublime and perfect. And then he comes in to do a verse where you can't understand what the hell he's saying. And it's like, well, why is this here? And the answer that I kind of came up with in my mind is that like Solange is sort of like, let's call her like a high millennial artist.
Sure.
Very kind of hard on her sleeve, very strong personality. But then you have like Playboi Carti, who's almost like a high zoomer, right? He's like almost the epitome of like a certain zoomer ideal of being like really mysterious and intense and not seeming to care about much of anything. But then he cares about so little that you wonder what he does care about, right? And in that song, you almost have like that generational boundary within the space of like, a minute or two.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean this whole part about the ugliness, like it made me question, why do I listen to music if not to find something beautiful? And I feel like, yeah, I mean, there are times when I listen to something explicitly because, yes, this is like a really beautiful piece that makes me think about life. But most of the time, it's either for, again, this like instinctive kind of amusement or distraction, or because I think for me, and I guess for a lot of people, like listening to an artist gives you a kind of cultural currency, because like, I don't know if there's a lot of hype around them, or it's like it's a cultural marker that you can hang your identity on, and then you can post about that artist, you can and like people are going to make assumptions about you. And I don't know, like I think some of these songs I listen to, like they're not going to be meaningful to me 10 years down the line, but at least for now, like the hype is enough to give me some kind of cultural it has some cultural significance, even if it's not inherently beautiful.
And I actually don't think there's anything wrong with that. Like,
yeah,
it's the reason that people watch sports in a way. It's like something to care about and talk about, and it's a way to connect with, people you otherwise might not have any reason to connect with. By the way, I think that's also kind of why hip hop has eclipsed every other aspect of pop culture. Like, it's bigger personalities. There's an element of psychodrama to it. It's just a lot more fun. It has kind of like a pro wrestling element to it that,
yeah, I can
again, can be very, it can be very dark,
Mhm.
you know, because the pro wrestling element sometimes actually gets these artists killed. But
It can be very beautiful too, though.
yes, it can be. Yeah,
Like, yeah, it's versatile.
yeah,
But I do think it's a problem if we can't distinguish something like liking something because of the hype versus liking it because it's beautiful. Because like
yeah,
if we substitute this category of hype or excitement for beauty, then like I don't know, our sense of self, our sense of reality is kind of out of order. I don't
oh
know. That's
yeah,
my sense of things. Because like I remember there's a point for me where like I don't know, like I used to really worship a lot of these artists when I was younger, and I realized like they can't offer me what I'm expecting them to give me, and if I'm
right.
going to keep looking at them as if this is what they are, like it really kind of like screwed me up. But when I'm able to say, okay, like I like this because it's fun, but I know this is not really my ultimate source of meaning in life. Okay, like it's reasonable, but again, it's
Yeah.
like I think it's hard for young people to make that distinction.
Yeah, and I also don't know. I mean, this is my big blind spot. Like, I don't know what young people are looking for in music these days. Like, I know what I was looking for when I was their age. You know, I was looking for stuff that made me feel less alone, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was looking for stuff that could kind of open some kind of new inner horizon in some way or another. And that actually attracts you to a lot of music that winds up not being that good.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, you know, we all like bands in high school that turned out to really suck.
Yeah.
You know, and later on, although maybe that's more a function of growing cynicism as you get older, but no, there were bands I liked in high school that sucked, like for sure. Uh, but I don't know. I don't know what kind of younger people are necessarily looking for in music.
You
Uh,
did say something about how being quarantined kind of impacted Zoomer's sense of aesthetics and art.
yeah,
I thought that was interesting.
yeah. Well, this kind of goes back to like a conversation that I often had the first few months of the pandemic, when I was quarantined with another writer here in Brooklyn. We were here for the first 3 months of the pandemic in New York, which was pretty brutal. But I had this repeated thought that like if I were like a junior in high school, I would never trust anybody or anything ever again,
Mm-hmm.
like ever again. Like, oh, like this is how easily like society can collapse, and this is how quickly like my senior year of high school can kind of disappear down the drain. And not just that, but like your freshman year of college, like
Yeah.
crucial
Mm-hmm.
years of your life. You know, the kids at Rolling Loud had basically taken away from them. And it would really leave me in like a dark mood.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm old enough to sort of have some perspective on like how long or how short 2 years and counting really is. But like, if I didn't have that, it would sort of color my view of reality forever, as I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure it will for some of these people. Uh,
Yeah.
and like inevitably, you're going to search out art that sort of like reflects your own frustration and your own sense of nothing really being all that solid. Uh, and like, I think Carti kind of does that
Mm-hmm.
in some ways. Trippy Red does too. Uh, like I think he's like a total nihilist in some in some respects.
Yeah.
Uh, or these other sorts of artists who are have kind of very mysterious either personas that are like really out there and kind of self-consciously gross, or ones who are like very kind of like retreated into themselves.
Mm-hmm.
um you know
Yeah,
like
I was gonna say like you made a connection to TikTok, and I think that's
yeah,
also it has to do with like I just see for a lot of young people while they were quarantined, like TikTok was their only way of connecting with
yeah,
people and getting information. So you kind of see how this aesthetic, I guess the
yeah,
fluidity or the I don't know, the vaporousness, as you said, like kind of speaks to this generation.
yeah. And TikTok, by the way, TikTok, I read the other week, is now like the number one website in the whole world.
Wow.
Like it passed the Google, like google.com, which is really crazy because like
Mm.
google.com is at least useful. Like people go to the Google
Yeah.
homepage because they're like, looking for, whatever people look for on Google, which is everything and anything.
Mhm.
TikTok is like a slot machine. It's really it's a slot machine.
Yeah.
It feeds a kind of like mental need, for constant kind of stimulation. And the things on it, I mean, you can find videos on TikTok that are like extremely clever and are actual sort of manifestations of something that could be considered genius. But then you find, like really bad kind of like cooking channels that have like, they're run by like a teenage girl in Detroit or something and have like 9 million followers. Like the numbers on TikTok are obscene. They're crazy. Like the stupidest, randomest people have like more followers on TikTok than like major heads of state do on Twitter.
Yeah.
And major rappers for that matter, and major, celebrities and stuff. It's like the celebrities of Twitter have as many followers as like, again, some like suburban teen, making sand art might have on TikTok. And again, it makes it seem as if like nothing matters and nothing's that important. And it's all just like people wasting time in like various stupid ways in order to then waste the time of other people in even stupider ways. And it's all kind of held together by this, like, again, like this slot machine type algorithm, this very real kind of like gamification of time just getting sucked away.
Yeah.
And like, I'm a Twitter addict, so I'm really no better than any of these other people. In fact, Twitter might be even worse.
I don't know. TikTok's
they're both bad. They're both probably pretty bad, but like, and you just wonder, like, is there some better thing that people could be doing? And I think, yeah, like, I mean, one of the reasons that, I mean, I know I'm on a podcast right now, but like one of the reasons I've always been suspicious of podcasting is that like people should be listening to music when they're listening to something. Like I'm like one of those, which is not to say that you shouldn't listen to the occasional podcast, obviously. Like, I don't think podcasts are 100% bad, but like, they're like, we're in a day and age where it's like really kind of easy. One of the blessings of technology, to expose yourself to all sorts of real, I don't want to call it high culture necessarily, but like, it's very easy to expose yourself to things that are more edifying than TikTok and Twitter.
Yeah,
of
course.
It's all there. It's all there on Spotify. It's all there on like, like every phone, every iPhone basically comes with a Kindle, more or less. You can download the Kindle app. It's like, listening to books on tape, whatever else, or just like looking around, just unplugging and like observing things, just like looking around the subway car, which is something that I used to have to do when I was a younger man in the city because smartphones hadn't been invented yet. How different would my brain have been if I had constant distraction on the train 100% of the time? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there needs to be some kind of like, sure, we all know it's better to like sit and look at nature or people than to like look at our phones, but there has to be something beyond just like, oh, I'm going to push myself to do something that's more edifying. I think that like that desire to contemplate beautiful things like has to be cultivated, and that's not just something I think we decide. Like, I think it's a matter of education and relationships that like, incline us towards that higher ideal. And if that's not available, that's hard.
Now, luckily, like, I think that there are things in pop culture that do point people towards that higher ideal. There's a lot of music that gets very, very popular these days that's like weirder and more interesting than the things that were comparably popular when I was a kid. For instance, I mean, like the Weeknd album that's coming out tomorrow night, that's something that like a ton of young people are going to listen to. And like, I think, I get the sense from like the teaser trailers that, he's kind of deep into his work with One Trick's Point Never, who back when I was a kid, in like 2009 was just sort of this like kind of obscure, really out there kind of sound artist guy who people didn't know much about. Now he's like basically co-producing a record that tens of millions of people are going to hear.
Hmm.
That's very cool.
You don't
And
think The
like,
Weeknd's nihilistic?
kind of. I mean, I know that he like plays a nihilist, but
Mhm.
when I listen to his music, I don't feel hopeless.
Okay,
I certainly
interesting.
don't, I certainly don't feel as if like I'm wallowing in any sort of meaninglessness.
Okay.
There are other artists who do that, I think, a lot more explicitly and quote unquote successfully, let's say. Um,
Yeah, because you said something interesting about like the whiny millennial crap, like talking about
yes.
Frank Ocean and Lana Del Rey. And
Yeah.
I mean, when I listen to those types of artists who, I would put The Weeknd in that category. Like, I think of
Yeah.
it as nihilistic, but I hear what you're saying that it's more hopeful than either like Cardi or Billie Eilish. Like,
Right.
I think there's more chaos in the newer sound versus like, at least in the vulnerability, yeah, it can become nihilistic, but at least there's some like actual human communicating something of the human experience. It's very
Oh,
clear.
yeah.
Like I get what's happening. I don't know.
Right. Exactly. So like it's funny, like, on Twitter I get served with these like every Twitter user, I get served with lots of tweets I don't want to see from accounts I don't follow.
Mhm.
So I get all these tweets about Playboi Carti from Playboi Carti stan accounts popping up in my feed. And one of them today, this was today, not making this up, read, Playboi Carti is the Frank Ocean of rap. And there was a second where I thought, well, yeah, actually that's true in the sense that both of them represent these important kind of hinge moments in music where there were, these very interesting kind of breaks with what had come before. On the other hand, like, no, actually Playboi Carti is like the negation of Frank Ocean and a lot of what Frank Ocean represented. Um, and I mean, I can tell you which of those two I'd rather listen to.
Yeah.
Uh, and by the way, when Frank Ocean eventually puts a new album out, that's also going to be huge, and a lot of young people will hear it, and it will
Yeah.
also expose them to thoughts and ideas that are highly elevated, and that'll be great. It's not all bad. I guess is what
Yeah.
I'm trying to say. But like, yeah, there's like Frank Ocean and Lana Del Rey are like, they come at it from a very kind of sideways angle, the way that great artists always do, but they're kind of
Mhm.
confessional. And like, if you listen to them enough and if you listen to them hard enough, you'll find a rawness to it and a certain kind of core of not just who they are, but who we all are in a sense.
Mhm.
Same with Solange, same with like a lot of these more kind of like, let's call them millennial pop stars. And maybe it's possible to hear that in Billie Eilish and Playboi Carti. And again, I admire both of them a lot because they make very strange music that got very, very popular.
Mhm.
But again, like, kind of what exactly do they sort of represent? Like, what
Yeah.
sort of center of their being? Maybe we'll eventually find out, and they'll keep progressing and evolving. They're both very young. I mean, Billie Eilish is 19 and Cardi's only 25, and they hopefully both have a lot of time left.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah. No, I
but
was
we just
gonna
don't
say
know
like
yet.
this makes me think about just the fact that like 90s, early 2000s music for me, because like I grew up listening mostly to R&B in addition to hip hop and like
Yeah,
more mainstream pop acts. And at that point, like it was still common for artists to really sing from their soul, like with this real emotional investment, and with like a sense of positivity. There was like a real sense of hopefulness, especially
yeah,
in soul music. But I think it was, yeah, like this turn towards the 2010s with people like The Weeknd, with Frank Ocean, with
yeah,
Solange. Like it's vulnerable, but it's this like ironic detachment. It wasn't as
yeah.
hopeful. And like I do
Yes,
think it does
that's true.
communicate something that's real and interesting about the human experience. But I do wonder, like, for people, for kids growing up on this sound, I do have this fear that something's lost. Like because there
Yeah,
isn't as much positivity or like real the detachment is what makes me feel like there's something I don't know.
right. And I've like wanted to write something for a while, and it would require kind of a lot of thought and a lot of time
Mhm.
about comparing and contrasting like Lana Del Rey and Bob Dylan.
Sure.
Uh, and like I think there are kind of a lot of similarities there. lyrically, narratively, they both have like a certain kind of sense of playfulness. Like I think Lana Del Rey is kind of a trickster in the same way that kind of he was.
Interesting.
And like I think they both constructed these very kind of like vague and like fluid personas for themselves in ways that are, that can be kind of compared and contrasted. But right, like, is there sort of a core of optimism to her music the way that there might have been to Dylan's at one point? And I don't know, maybe not. And also, like, more philosophically, does there have to be a core of positivity and optimism for art to work as art? And I've always thought yes. Like I've always thought that, like, no matter how good a movie is, if the light wasn't getting in, it couldn't be a great film. Like, if you think about even like the bleakest classic movies, there was always sort of something pointing towards something higher and better that was like kind of achievable. And there's all right. You can't be like entirely negative, like, in part because it just doesn't narratively work or sonically work, and in part because it's just not how life is. Human beings are not endlessly cynical. Actually, human beings end up being endlessly optimistic in some respects. There's a great need across all of human history, documented in art and literature, to find the light, even in circumstances far worse than the ones that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I mean, Kanye said this in the Drink Champs interview. I don't know if you saw it, but
I saw parts of it. It's great.
Yeah, like there's a part where he was saying that, like, if a rap song doesn't have, as he called it, like a redemption conclusion, or like he would say, like a rapper would say something about, I don't know, like objectifying a woman or something very like dark and self-destructive. And he's like, if you don't follow it up with some kind of redemptive lyric after that, like, it's socially irresponsible. And I think he's coming from, like, I don't know, this religious position that he's in now, but still, is it irresponsible to not offer some positive afterthought when you say something kind of dark or nihilistic? I don't know. I mean, I don't think art, I think it's exempt from certain moral scrutiny at a certain point, but it still does hold weight morally. I don't know. It's complicated.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think that, like, the specifics of it are wrong, but the broad strokes of it, I think, are right. Like, there has to be some kind of motioning towards something better and higher than what we see in our own lives and our own reality. Again, in order for art to really, really, really work. And Kanye has sort of figured out, I think, a very novel and interesting way of translating that idea into rap music. Right. I mean, Donda is like this very kind of complex work about hope and despair and memory, and guilt, and all these other sort of topics that he more and less successfully kind of weaves together over the course of an album that, again, is excellent at times and baffling at others. It's a good ideal to kind of shoot for, or at least a good thing to kind of have in the back of your mind if you're creating art that you really want to connect with people. And by the way, that's another kind of album where there was this interesting kind of, or a moment, let's say, among the many in the last couple of years, of there being a real disjuncture between, elite opinion and popular opinion, let's say. Like, it's an album that that the sort of cultural gatekeeper types really didn't like for the most part. But it seemed to have been really kind of embraced by a lot of people, for reasons other than just Kanye's celebrity, by the way. Like, I think Donda's a record that people are still going to listen to and like in 10 or 15 years.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So just to wrap things up, do you have any plugs that you want to make, either to social media or your writing?
Oh man, good question. Well, first of all, everybody go to tabletmag.com. Like I said, we're a kind of a Jewish focused magazine, but really we're for everyone. You'll get the religion stuff, but also reporting and essays on, all sorts of different things from all sorts of different perspectives.
Mhm.
Like, I think we pride ourselves on being a bit more pluralistic and less judgy and less stodgy than a lot of the rest of the media is. So it's worth checking out no matter who you are, tabletmag.com. I'm on Twitter at ARMINROSEN, Armin Rosen, at Armin Rosen. So first name, last name, simple enough. And what else? I mean, I've resisted the urge to ever join Instagram, so I'm not on that. Thank God.
Better that way.
It would eat up even more of my time.
Yeah.
And I'm on Spotify. I've made a few playlists, some of them good, some of them embarrassing, a few of them kind of publicly facing. I've done this kind of experiment of running and this is something Jeff Weiss at Passion of the Weiss has done, where he has kind of a running playlist that'll change every few months. So I've got one of those that
Nice.
I'm trying to, use it as a way of turning people on to whatever music is kind of bugging me on on any particular week or month. And let's see I think that's pretty much it for now.
Awesome. So I'll link all of that in the description. But Armin, thank you for joining us. This was good.
Well, thanks for having me on. This is great.
All right.
And thanks for reading.
For sure.